What's up, guys? Thanks for watching. Would appreciate a like, subscribe, comment down below. Would love to see you engage, and thanks for watching. On April 7th of this year, Charlie Kirk posted one of his infamous controversial tweets. Citing a report from an organization called the National Contagion Research Institute, Kirk pointed out a disturbing trend. As analyzed by the lead author Joel Finkelstein, the NCRI reported that death threats among, at the time, the two most influential men in America, Elon Musk and Donald Trump, were rising precipitously. But they weren't rising overall. Instead, their findings, disturbingly enough, were partisan in nature. Kirk's tweet read as follows, quote, "Assassination culture is spreading on the left. 48% of liberals say it would be at least somewhat justified to murder Elon Musk. 55% said the same about Donald Trump. In California, activists are naming ballot measures after Luigi Mangione. The left is being whipped into a violent frenzy. Any setback, whether losing an election or losing a court case, justifies a maximally violent response. This is the natural outgrowth of left-wing protest culture tolerating violence and mayhem for years on end. The cowardice of local prosecutors and school officials have turned the left into a ticking time bomb." End quote. We all know the rest of the story, of course. 5 months and 3 days later, Kirk was assassinated on the campus of Utah Valley University, prophetically fulfilling his own martyrdom. Afterwards, at movements such as the No Kings protest, person after person, once again inspired by what Kirk had just dubbed quote-unquote protest culture, mocked his murder over and over again. The outgrowth of wokeism, the most open expression of Marxist grievance and resentment politics in modern history, had only one natural conclusion to draw. The sad part is that, particularly on the MAGA right, this was nothing new. Donald Trump, for example, had just been nearly killed twice a little over a year before that. Tesla dealerships, at the time of Kirk's tweet, were being firebombed left and right, which also had approval by the left. Threats against the conservative movement, particularly in part after the hysterics of the early 2020s, were reaching a fever pitch. And if we're all honest about it, we all knew where this was going. Tucker Carlson, as an example, called it out in an interview with Adam Carolla almost a year before the first attempt on Trump's life. Quote, "Begin with criticism, then you go to protest, then you go to impeachment, now you go to indictment, and none of them work. I mean, what's next? Graph it out, man. We're speeding towards assassination, obviously. No one will say that, but I don't know how you can't reach that conclusion." End quote. The usual outlets mocked Carlson for saying this. NBC News put out a piece entitled, quote, "Tucker Carlson stokes conspiracy, claims U.S. is, quote, speeding towards assassination of Trump," end quote. Forbes magazine, supposedly a relevant business journalistic outlet, said similar, quote, "Tucker Carlson's Trump assassination conspiracy explained. Where it started, who is pushing it," end quote. Whoops. But in actuality, Forbes asked a good question, the key question to understand this rise in extremist and violent rhetoric. Where did this start? Who is pushing it? To understand the psychology of someone like Tyler Robinson or Thomas Matthew Crooks or Ryan Ruth is one thing. But to understand what motivated their psychology is far more useful and far more insightful to our current cultural moment. It's hard to put a pulse on what one thing, if there is indeed one thing, which is unlikely, has given rise to this massive uptick of political violence. It would be the rhetoric of our chattering and ruling classes, particularly when it came to Charlie Kirk's assassination and the attempted assassinations of Donald Trump. This rhetoric only went one way, leftward. The biggest apparatus that led to this was the mainstream press. Ever since Trump took his now infamous ride down the golden escalator in 2015, the slanders have come fast and furious. Racist, misogynist, homophobe. Soon, the names started upping themselves into historical figures, most specifically Adolf Hitler, a name the neocon right had once associated with the now disposed dictator Saddam Hussein before they overthrew him in Iraq. However, as Trump's ascent to his second non-consecutive term began to prove itself more of a factor than the American left would have liked, they only had one reaction: to up the ante. It was now not enough just to call Trump Hitler. Now the New Republic had to create a propaganda magazine covering depicting Trump as Hitler. Instead of Joe Biden aiming his ire at Trump himself, he called his base, quote-unquote, garbage, no more than the leftovers of your breakfast you ate this morning. Rumors of the, quote, last election began to swirl, whipping up Democrats into a frenzy of totalitarian oligarchy that they believed was coming down the pike. Given this rhetoric of a new dictator rising, this time in America, there was only one valid response on the left: violence. Wouldn't you kill baby Hitler if you had the chance? They said. If you had a shot to hit a teenage Joseph Stalin or Idi Amin with your car, wouldn't you take it? If not, you'd be a bad person, no doubt about it. You must hate Jews or poor people or a different tribe of ethnic Africans that also inconveniently inhabit the region. Are these valid conclusions to draw our expectations to have of people? We should hope not. A culture that is pushed to believe that violence is the only remaining solution to their problems is not a culture that will survive very long. That's why Western civilization, and America specifically, is a miracle of human achievement and perhaps the greatest showing of the grace of God. Humans, for the longest time, focused far too much on destroying their enemies that they focused very little on actually building for continuity. When Donald Trump won the presidency back a little over a year ago, he made a promise to the American people. The ideology that created this culture would be stamped out. He largely has delivered on that promise, to give him credit. Pete Hegseth has purged it from our military. Affirmative action has been taken out. Big tech has conceded ground on totalitarian Marxist ideology inside of their workplaces. Colleges live in fear every day that their federal funding could be cut. Gender ideology has been exposed for the most grievous evil we've ever committed against our children. We have stacked many wins on this front and should be very grateful for them. However, it's here the conservatives and all value-driven people, if I'm being honest, have made a critical error. There was a popular phrase that began to take hold after Trump assumed office for the second time. Quote, woke is dead. The biggest thing that common sense Americans thought after Trump took office again was that the madness would stop, that everything would go back to business as usual, that the insane people that came out of the closet would just conveniently stuff themselves back inside. But we were wrong. Wokeism, which is, again, just another outgrowth of Marxist ideology, is not dead, because Marxism and the culture of death that it is based on is not dead. Rather, in our day and age, it is simply morphed. It is not the same as it once was, where the monsters who spouted this ideology told you that the interest rate scale was somehow racist, or your 5-year-old daughter identified as a demisexual or something. The person who has best described this extreme version of Marxism and wokeism, or as Charlie Kirk called, quote, assassination culture, is Steve Deace. After Kirk's assassination, Deace, a close friend of Kirk's, called Kirk's murder the defining moment of what he dubbed, quote, political sadism. Put simply, political sadism, is the opposition of a political movement rejoicing in the suffering of the political movement they oppose. They enjoy when bad things happen to them. They want them to hurt, to break, to mourn. Deace's point was proven correct in the immediate aftermath of Kirk's assassination. The amount of social media posts, particularly and most disturbingly from government employees, healthcare professionals, and teachers who celebrated the murder, was disgusting. Liberal college women dressed as him when they went out in sexy clothing on Halloween. The mainstream press, who ginned much of this up, by the way, is now back to calling Kirk all of these things that got him assassinated in the first place. White supremacist, fascist, Nazi. But what MAGA didn't expect to happen was for this political sadism to be turned against itself. After Kirk's memorial, where there was almost unprecedented unity on the right, all of that was soon shredded by the one topic that Kirk almost single-handedly held everyone together on: Israel. Kirk, himself a very pro-Israel person, was starting to question the almost sycophantic relationship the United States had with Israel. For even voicing some criticism, he had millions in donations pulled from his nonprofit, Turning Point USA, being put on blast by pro-Israel voices, and was threatened further by the rising tide of Zionism in the United States. And I should make it clear, this is not to say that quote-unquote Israel killed Charlie Kirk, because no one knows who killed Charlie Kirk. Not the FBI, not Candace Owens, not anyone. Anyone who says they do, definitively, is lying to you. They are not telling the whole truth, because these things take patience and time. We shouldn't waste our time trying to find out these answers right now. But there is something we can do. Something that's going to be incredibly uncomfortable, but something that is absolutely essential for the preservation of our social fabric. And that thing is doing what Steve Deace called the American right to do after Kirk's killing: purge political sadism of all types. We have largely done this with things like neoconservatism and wokeism, and this is good. But there is still much work we have left to do. America will no longer be a country if we accept that hurting and killing each other counts as acceptable discourse. We must roll up our sleeves, do the dirty work, and get to the root of the issue. The biggest arm of rising political sadism in America today is Zionism, particularly and most shamefully, Christian Zionism. The amount of hysteria over how fanatical of a supporter of Israel you are, which is, curiously, even more powerful after the ceasefire in the War of Gaza, it's interesting to note, has been ramping aggressively ever since people started figuring out what was really going on in the region. Something strange begins to happen when people start losing grip on a narrative. Take COVID, establishment politics, Black Lives Matter, the war in Ukraine, for examples. The supporter of the now exposed wrong side of the issue start to embody disturbing traits. They become hysterical, radical, and not unlike at all the people they claim to hate. And depending on how socially palatable that cause is, the people who enforce that issue can get away with it for a while. But the truth will always come out. COVID came from a lab in China. The uniparty DC establishment is united against the American citizen. Black Lives Matter is a grift. The war in Ukraine is a money laundering operation. All of these things have been exposed. And the same exact thing is true with American Zionism towards the Israeli government, an obsession with defending a foreign government while ruthlessly criticizing our own, by the way, and tearing apart those who defend ours. And like the other indefensible positions named, it was only a matter of time before they all succumbed to hysteria. Take Mark Levin, for example. Levin, always a glorified man-child who screamed at Fox News boomers while telling them to quote-unquote set their DVRs, has gone completely off the deep end. Like the American left did to Trump, he is now completely fixed on calling everyone who disagrees with him a quote-unquote Jew hater or a quote-unquote Nazi. He's no different than being a race-baiting DEI consultant or a childless cat lady, which he is, only I believe Levin prefers dogs, thankfully. Mark Levin has no children. He's one of the last people on a sinking ship of cable news. All of his positions are highly unpopular. He has nothing. No legacy, no relevance, no anything. So he does exactly what all who are in his position, no matter their political positions, by the way, do. Try to drag as many people down with him before he completely fades into oblivion as a deranged and hateful narcissist whose self-obsession reeks off of everything that he does. But it goes deeper than cable news clowns like Mark Levin. Again, it's one thing to simply label someone something, as Mark Levin does by foolishly trying to convince people that Tucker Carlson hates Jews or something. It's another to completely fall into bed with violence in and of itself, to celebrate and fetishize the people you hate getting assaulted or killed by some deranged radical. And for this despicable behavior, we go to the most repugnant of all of our institutions that have fallen into this trap of new wokeism and political sadism, the Babylon Bee. The Babylon Bee, ironically the sole reason that Elon Musk bought Twitter, and the reason why America still has free speech, has become the greatest right-wing arbiter of cancel culture, censorship, and hate. Every one of their influencers who call themselves legitimate evangelical Christians is completely devoted to the cause of Christian Zionism, a term that is completely illegitimate and oxymoronic by definition. And there are two examples that prove this as such. The warning shot across the bow was fired earlier this year by Joel Berry, the second in command at the Babylon Bee. In July of this year, the Israeli government fired openly and bombed the only Catholic church in Gaza, slaughtering all who were inside for the crime of worshiping Jesus Christ, who Joel Berry also claims to worship. This is a martyrdom, a mask-off moment for a nation that apparently only wanted to quote-unquote destroy Hamas. In response, Berry, one of the most prominent so-called Christians in this country, put this out on X as a response, quote, "This won't be easy for the people to hear, but there are only about 200 professed Catholics still living in Gaza, and they all support Hamas. The true Christian faith still exists in Gaza, but it's all underground. Anyone allowed by Hamas to practice openly is allowed to do so because they aid and support the terror regime." End quote. Got that? As long as there are only 200 Catholics in Gaza, you can feel free to kill as many of them as you want. Only Joel Berry gets to decide what true Christian faith is, not God or anything. No one could possibly come to Christ outside of those 200, not like we haven't seen literally thousands of radical Muslims convert in the region over the past years or anything. And if they did, they probably would aid and support the terror regime, obviously. So might as well huddle them up so it makes the IDF have an easier shot at them. And if that weren't enough, the following act sure was. 2 weekends ago, the Babylon Bee, on command by their founder Seth Dillon, Berry, and all of their minions, put up an article about Megyn Kelly, whose headline read, quote, "Megyn Kelly gets rid of old pager just to be safe." The article was referencing a prior Israeli terrorist attack on terror organization Hezbollah, where they tapped pagers with explosive devices to blow the genitals, legs, and stomachs off of their enemies, not unlike the common IED that blew the genitals, legs, and stomachs off of our soldiers in Afghanistan. But now, since they were our enemies, our neocons and his Israel First supporters cheered from the stands like the fanatical and mindless oafs they were. Which brings us to the oddest part and the most sinister part. Megyn Kelly? Really? Someone who's shown nothing but support not only for Israel, but to Israel's ghastly methods that have led to a genocide? Pick a better person to go after. Someone who is actually an anti-Semite, for instance. But like a growing number of the MAGAverse that have run afoul of the Israel First crowd, Megyn Kelly was ripe for the picking. And there was no one more taken aback by this, and rightly so, than Megyn Kelly herself. Reposting the initial article with a simple, quote-unquote, what the fuck, Seth Dillon, the alarm was officially sounded on the Babylon Bee. The article was swiftly taken down. Seth Dillon, who orchestrated and approved the article, said nothing, just as he said nothing to anyone about his relationship with Charlie Kirk at the now infamous Hamptons meeting. But that's just a coincidence, I'm sure. With that one article, the Babylon Bee crossed the line. But that's not even the craziest part of all of this. The Babylon Bee is a satirical news site like The Onion. So if they were just kidding around with the idea of Megyn Kelly getting killed by Israel, why would they take it down? Why would they even bother defending it? I'll tell you why. Because they mean it. The Zionist movement wants Megyn Kelly to shut up by any means necessary. They actually want to harm people that oppose their cause, their lunacy, their crowd derangement syndrome. Just ask Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens or Dave Smith or Charlie Kirk for that matter, even though you're apparently not supposed to say that. But we should say it. Why? Because Zionism, like all other forms of ethnic, racial, and religious hatred, should be condemned. Because Zionism is no different than racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, jihadism, Nazism, or anything else like it. It is not a movement based on values. It is a movement based on resentment, on guilt, on power, of nothing but a combined immutable characteristic that has nothing to do with any higher value system. Zionism is a poison, and we should treat it as such. Most importantly, because someone is going to get killed if this doesn't stop. Again, someone will actually try to kill Megyn Kelly, or Steve Bannon, or Nick Fuentes, or Alex Jones, or Matt Walsh, or Glenn Greenwald, or Jimmy Dore, or Kim Iverson. It already happened once with Charlie Kirk. It almost happened 2 more times to the most powerful man in the world, Donald Trump. To act like this kind of hatred couldn't morph into violence would be ignorant about how both hate and violence work. And we, as value-driven people, must be the ones to stop it. We must be the ones who say no to all forms of collective guilt and punishment. We're above that, more evolved than that. If we go back to a world defined by bigotry and blood guilt, we lose everything. And given the fact we've already lost so much, we can't afford to lose much more.